shortly. So, hello Rotarians, Rotaractors, guests, and friends. Welcome to this week's District 5960 Friday feature. My name is Paul Perez, and I am the District Governor for District 5960. We are pleased you're joining us here live virtually to be part of this presentation. Here with me today to moderate the presentation and to introduce the speaker is past District Governor Marlene Gargolak from Rice Lake Rotary. Marlene?
He's on Zoom, and that's pretty cool. But today, my job is to introduce a friend and a person who has worked tirelessly in his career to promote our natural resources, our national parks. As he has worked for the Park Service for many years, I think about 35, maybe. Chris, is that right?
Close enough.
Close enough. I first met Chris at the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway in St. Croix Falls when he invited me to join him for a meeting to discuss pollinators. And Chris is probably one of the biggest advocate his main skill or biggest skill is developing and nurturing partnerships, as he has done so with so many organizations, public and private. And I can't believe hardly that he has maintained his diligence in working with Rotary, but I'm so excited to hear what he has to say again today. Chris is currently serving as the Chief of Heritage Areas and Partnerships in the National Park Service in the Midwest region. And he's going to share with us today what he does and what we can be encouraged to do. So it is with great pleasure I introduce Chris Stein, from the National Park Service. Go ahead, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Marlene. And before we get started, I just want to thank Rotary, all of you, for the support that you've given to National Park Service projects over the years, starting with Craig Leiser in 5960. I've worked with various district governors like Judy Freund, Marlene Gargolak, club members like Fred Schreiber, John Lennis, so many others. And you've always been so supportive of helping the National Park Service with our preservation and conservation work, and I appreciate that. So Kathy, on that note, if you could start the slides, that would be great. So today, and sorry, it's gone blank on my screen. I got it back. Today I'm going to be speaking about the National Heritage Area Program of the National Park Service, to give you some context to the next topic, which is connected conservation or large landscape conservation. And I'm going to focus on a program called Operation Pollination, but I'll talk about migratory land birds, a little bit about migratory land birds and grasslands as well. Next slide. This is the National Heritage Area landscape across the United States. There are 55 national heritage areas. And Marlene mentioned I work for the National Park Service. I'm a park ranger with the National Park Service. And prior to this current assignment that I have, I've always worked in a national park, like Yosemite or the Great Smoky Mountains or the National Park of America in Samoa in the South Pacific. But these national heritage areas, these are also administered by the National Park Service, but they're almost like stepchildren in a way. They don't get the same play as the bigger areas get, but you can see from their size and scope, they are across the country and quite large. And can you imagine all the Rotary clubs that are located within these national heritage areas? Quite a few. Next slide. These next two slides, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on them, and then I promise I will go quicker. But just so you understand what a national heritage area is, and I think this is important as taxpayers and U.S. citizens, that you understand what these heritage areas are. Number one, they're large lived-in landscapes, often thousands of square miles in extent, and they're primarily private land. The federal government does not own any land associated with the National Heritage Area designation. And these heritage areas are home to millions of people, and they each have a nationally important story to tell, just like national parks. They're like national parks, they're individually designated by an act of the United States Congress, but they don't have any one act, like an organic act, to guide them. They have all these individuals, 55 different acts that guide them. Next slide, Kath. The National Park Service, we provide administrative oversight. That's my job. Quite frankly, not the more exciting part of my job. That means I review work plans and budgets and cooperative agreements and things like that, because the Park Service gives each National Heritage Area at least $300,000 a year to manage that heritage area. And with that money, there has to be accountability. And that's what I do. I make sure these heritage areas are accountable for the taxpayer dollars, but also, and very excitingly, for every dollar that we give to a National Heritage Area, they have to match one-on-one. And usually the match is more like 5-to-1. Each National Heritage Area is managed by a separate non-government organization, usually. Sometimes it's a state government or a university. Each National Heritage Area has a very small staff, 2 to 6 people. And each National Heritage Area has a sunset date. They expire. After 15 years, they go away unless they have another act of Congress to extend them. Next slide. So in the Midwest region, or regions 3, 4, and 5, as we're called, there are 8 National Heritage Areas. And these are the people that I work most closely with. So the reach is from North Dakota to Ohio, down to Arkansas, and back up to North Dakota. And within that area, there are 8 National Heritage Areas. And if you took the area of these heritage areas and combined it, it would exceed the size of any one state in the Midwest region. Larger than Minnesota, larger than Nebraska, any state. Next slide. And these are the proposed National Heritage Areas. This is a growing program. And so there are 6 proposed areas in the Midwest region. One of these days, the map is going to be covered. So when I say proposed, that means that most of them have a long way to go to get official designation. I'll talk about 2 that are currently pretty close later on in this program, but it's a long process to get designated as a National Heritage Area. You have to think more in geologic time than in regular time, because it's not unusual to be at it for 10 years or more to get established. And these heritage areas, they're established by grassroots efforts. It's local people who are basically petitioning the United States government, saying that my area is nationally significant and I want to be recognized with that National Heritage Area designation. Next slide. Each National Heritage Area has a specific mission given to it by this act of Congress, and we'll get into that in a minute. But all National Heritage Areas have these 6 broad goals: recreation, education, conservation, interpretation, preservation, and economic development. And for those who are undergoing this designation, I just say, remember the word recipe, and you will know what your goals are. Next slide. So let's take a quick tour of the 8 National Heritage Areas in the Midwest region, and we'll talk about 2 proposed ones. Next slide. The first area is the Northern Plains National Heritage Area in central North Dakota around Bismarck. This is along an 80-mile free-flowing stretch of the Missouri River. Next slide. And the reasons why the Northern Plains National Heritage Area were designated is because here along the Missouri River, prior to European settlement, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Arikara Indians, they were growing crops, early American agriculturalists. This is also where Lewis and Clark spent their first winter out in their 2-year expedition. You might recall that the Mandan sheltered the explorers that first winter, and if it wasn't for the shelter that they gave the expedition probably would have failed. Also, the important thing here is the story of westward expansion and the Indian Wars. Next slide. Kathy, just go back one slide if you could. That bottom right slide, by the way, that's Interstate 90 in the background across the Missouri River. And that building being built is a new visitor center that is right along the interstate. So any of you heading out to Montana or Yellowstone, whatever, if you're going on Interstate 90, do stop at the new visitor center that was scheduled to open this summer. I'm not sure what's going to happen now, but it's a new building and it should have nice interpretive exhibits on Northern Plains. Next slide. Silos and Smokestacks is our closest national heritage area. This is a 25,000 square mile area in northeast Iowa. You might have seen the old signs on the highway as you go down 35. They need to be replaced. They are in the process of being replaced. But this is the story, next slide, of America's agricultural heritage. And they have lots of partners, about 119 partners or so. And one of those partners, the Grout Museum, they have a Voices of Iowa project currently going on where they've already taken more than 300 oral histories of farm stories. So that'll be a nice repository of talking about America's agricultural heritage. Next slide. All national heritage areas can show this type of economic impact. As I mentioned when I talked about the 6 goals of national heritage areas, economic development is a very important part of that goal, not only conservation, preservation, recreation, etc., but economic development. They need to show to Congress that that designation has made a significant economic impact in their area. Next slide. The first national heritage area in the nation was only established 35 years ago. And that's the Illinois and Michigan Canal, or the I&M Canal National Heritage Area out of Chicago. It stretches for about 100 miles to the west of Chicago out to LaSalle, Illinois. And this was a canal that was built in the early 19th century to connect the Mississippi River with the Great Lakes. We were not concerned, Craig, about Asian carp and things like that back then. So this was to connect the waterways. Little did they know, 200 years later, we'd be very concerned about what those connections did to the environment. But in 1984, President Ronald Reagan, he signed the legislation that created the Illinois and Michigan Canal National Heritage Area. Next slide. And if you go down there, perhaps some of you have, it's just a beautiful place. It's a narrow, skinny area. The towpath is still intact. That upper right photo, if you want to go out on a canal boat, you can be pulled by a mule for a short canal ride. It's a great outdoor recreation experience. Next slide. One of my favorite areas, they're actually all my favorite, is the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area in central Illinois, a 25,000 square mile area as well. It tells the story of Abraham Lincoln's life before he became president of the United States. Next slide. And there they do things like have a Lincoln Leadership Academy that brings in underserved youth to teach them leadership skills based on Abraham Lincoln's leadership. They have a book series on Abraham Lincoln. They have a few gentlemen who actually portray Lincoln and go around into the community and pretend they do living history. Really quite a fine place. And if you've not been down to Springfield to see where Lincoln's home is, which is a National Historic Site within the National Heritage Area, a national park within the National Heritage Area, I highly recommend you go down there. And the Abraham Lincoln presidential library is really just an amazing place. Next slide. So Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area in eastern Kansas and western Missouri. This is a 32,000 square mile National Heritage Area. This is the largest National Heritage Area in the Midwest. To give you an example, the smallest state in the Union, Rhode Island, is about 1,500 square miles. And this National Heritage Area is 32,000 square miles. They have a staff of 4 people here to manage that area. And the only way they can get work done, next slide, is to work with all the multitude of partners that help tell the stories of the settlement of the frontier, the border and Civil War on the western frontier. Some of you may know that after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, there was a rush out west by those who believed in slavery and those who did not believe in slavery. And there was actually bloodshed out on the western frontier 10 years prior to the actual start of the Civil War. And this area also talks about the enduring struggle for freedom. It's here where the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site in Topeka, Kansas is located. And the Brown versus Board of Education site is also a full-blown national park located within the National Heritage Area. Next slide, Kathy, please. Motor City's National Heritage Area around Detroit, Michigan is a 10,000 square mile area established to tell the story of the birthplace of the automobile industry in America. That top right slide, the Ford Briquette plant, that's where Henry Ford invented the Model T. And just to show you, this area probably is our area that has the most population. There's 6.5 million people that live within the boundaries of Motor City's National Heritage Area. So, you know, these areas, again, are not protected in the sense like a national park is protected, you know, where we draw around a line around an area and we call it good. You know, that's protected. We have to do a lot of things to make sure that protection takes place. But in National Heritage areas, it's really by the goodwill of the people and trying to use the good name of the National Park Service and what we stand for to help protect these very important resources. Those of you who know Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, that's Debbie Dingell on the bottom left. She is a real supporter of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area. Next slide. Like the other National Heritage areas, Motor Cities can show great economic, appropriately scaled economic development activities. These are just some of the programs that are taking place at the Motor Cities National Heritage Area, including one of my favorite projects right there on the bottom right, that graphic of the 4th Street Bridge Interpretive Park. That was a vacant city lot that, with the help of the National Heritage Area, they're now turning it into a nice little pocket of green by the 4th Street Bridge, which was important in automobile history. There was a strike there, and it helped lead to the United Auto Workers Union. Next slide. National Aviation Heritage Area in Southwest Ohio centers around Dayton, Ohio. This is where Orville and Wilbur Wright invented the airplane. Next slide. You can actually go out to the field. That middle slide there, that's actually the Huffman Prairie. That's the field where the Wright brothers mastered the principles of controlled powered flight. So it was basically the world's first practical airplane. As that industry grew, they actually, that bottom slide shows you the Wright brothers factory where they manufactured airplanes eventually. Next slide. And the last National Heritage Area I want to talk about that is currently established in the Midwest regions is the Ohio and Erie Canalway. This connects Lake Erie right up around Cleveland, Ohio to the Ohio watershed, which of course also empties into the Mississippi. Next slide. Here, like in all these heritage areas, there are great recreational opportunities. They rely upon the good graces of volunteers to get a lot of the work done. And just a real good story and wholesome place to go to. Next slide. And you don't have to answer me right now. We can talk about this during Q&A. But I'm hoping that you learn something new, that these National Heritage Areas, number one, that they exist, Number two, that you saw the heritage areas in the Midwest region. And just know that I only talked about 8. I'm going to tell you about 2 more here that are proposed. But remember, there's 55 of these special places across the United States. 2 proposed national heritage areas. I mention them because they are near having legislation passed, is the Calumet National Heritage Area from South Chicago, wrapping around the south shore of Lake Michigan, including Indiana Dunes. And this is one of the most, believe it or not, one of the most biologically diverse places in the United States. I believe that the Indiana Dunes National Park is considered the 4th most biologically diverse place in the national park system. It's pretty amazing, so close to an urban center like Chicago to have this great resource. Next slide. And as you will see from this slide, I highlighted in blue, this is their progress to date, but they also have legislation in progress. And I'm hoping that within the next year or 2 that Congress actually designates the Calumet National Heritage Area. Next slide. And the heritage area that's proposed, that's the most near and dear to my heart, because I have worked with them for 10 years, and that's the proposed North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix National Heritage Area, which tells the North Woods logging story, the story of environmental restoration, and the development of a conservation ethic. Next slide. These are their goals, 2020 goals of the North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix Heritage Area. And they're not even designated, and you can see that they're already starting to do great things. And we'll focus in on the next slide on just two goals that they have for this year. And the next slide. So they've recently put out an events calendar. It's called North Woods and Waters Links. And those of you who might be inclined to visit Stillwater once we get, or the St. Croix Valley once we get back up and running, if you take down this site, the name, you can actually go to this link site and see all the different activities that are taking place in the St. Croix Valley, in the proposed boundary of the North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix. So it's a good site to go to. They also want to turbocharge this program called Operation Pollination, and that's music to my ears. And we'll now, in this second part of the program, we'll switch to talking about some large landscape conservation, or connected conservation as we call it, projects in the Midwest region. Next slide. So to date, the National Park Service has not capitalized to the fullest extent possible on our natural resource management work with national heritage areas. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in my position is trying to kind of do a little organizational shift to think more about natural resource management as well as cultural and historical resource management. Next slide. So these are the 3 areas that I'm currently working in. And in the bold, you can see the case that I have made for each of these 3 activities. With pollinators, let's face it, pollinators are declining worldwide, yet 75% of the world's plant species, including our agricultural crops, require pollinators. Migratory land birds, the case here is that over the past 50 years, we have 3 billion birds less in North America today than we did back in 1970. 3 billion birds. That's a 30% population decrease. And then grasslands restoration and rights of way as habitat. Grasslands are the most threatened habitat in North America, therefore grassland nesting birds are the most threatened bird species. And this rights of way as habitat concept, you've all been driving down interstate highways and you've seen departments of transportation over mowing the rights of way, right? So this rights of way as habitat concept is basically says, yeah, we need to make highways safe. So when a car needs to pull over and have work done on it or be towed away, that can take place. But there's a lot of potential habitat there for birds, for insects, and other animals. If you look at that that bold statement there are 4 million miles of roads and 100,000 miles of large transmission lines in the United States. Ever since I got thinking about rights of way as habitat, I've looked at those large transmission corridors in a whole new different way, that there's potential habitat for species to migrate along those routes. And we'll talk about that just a little bit at the end of this program. But I want to now focus on a pollinator project called Operation Pollination. Next slide. So pollinators, the National Park Service, as a preservation organization, we should be very concerned about the state of health of our pollinators. And that's what I have been working on for the past couple of years with this project called Operation Pollination. Next slide. It all started out in the St. Croix Valley of Minnesota and Wisconsin, that blue rectangle. And in 2015, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service, we kicked off a project called the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership. And when we kicked it off at Anderson Corporation in August of 2015, and Marlene was there, she gave a talk and talked about Rotary's involvement and how she got Rotary involved in this. When we kicked it off, there were 75 partners. I'll show you that list in a minute, but today that partnership has over 125 partners. In 2018, when I took my job, my new job working with national heritage areas rather than with national parks, I said, maybe we can transport this great project that took place in the St. Croix Valley and see if some of these national heritage areas in our region will buy into this. And so these three areas in orange, circled, the orange circle, they decided that they would experiment. Next slide. And this was the kickoff of the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership at Anderson Corporation. These are the representatives from those three federal land management agencies with our Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who, by the way, Betty is the chair of the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee. She is the Congresswoman who chairs the committee that gives all the land management agencies their money. So we were really honored to have her at this kickoff. And she knows what's taking place, in the St. Croix Valley and around the nation with this project. Next slide. One of the focuses has been on the monarch butterfly, and the monarch is a flagship species. And this distribution and population density map of the monarch kind of shows you why the National Park Service in our Midwest regions, which are outlined in that white, should be concerned about the monarch butterfly. By the way, all those little black dots on the map within that NPS zone, those are all the full-fledged national park sites within that region. Again, the National Heritage Area is very different from the national parks, but that's what those little black dots are. Next slide. So this is what one does. You might recall that form on the right from when in Marlene's term as district governor, she went around and was a real champion trying to get Rotary clubs to sign on to the Pollinator Partnership. But that form on the left shows you just what a resolution looks like, not form, that document on the left shows you a resolution, and the form on the right kind of shows you what a pollinator pledge looks like. And some of you on this call may have signed that. Next slide. And this next slide shows you the 75 different groups that were involved with the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership when it was first launched in 2015. You might notice some big names on there, like XL Energy, Anderson Corporation, Thomson Reuters, Rotary Club, District 5960. You can see 5960 right in the middle there. There are some individual clubs on this as well, like the White Bear Lake Rotary Club. They had already signed on. Again, there's now 125 names on this pledge form. But there's also small groups, not only the big groups, there's small groups like Yoga by Julie. She was my former yoga instructor, and one day she came in with little milkweed seed packets to give out to each of her yoginis so they could plant in their backyard. The Osceola Braves Little League Baseball team. Organizations large and small are invited to join this cause. Next slide. And so after the 3 national heritage areas in the Midwest region experimented with Operation Pollination. We rebranded the name, by the way, from the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership to Operation Pollination, which could apply to anywhere. So today, just 2 years after that experiment, 33 national heritage areas around the United States have told me that they want to be part of Operation Pollination. They do have capacity issues. You know, when a National Heritage Area Executive Director wakes up in the morning, they're not thinking about pollinators. They're thinking about carrying out the mission, the individual mission that Congress gave them. But nonetheless, it is part of their goal. Conservation, preservation is part of their goal. And these are great places where we can restore pollinator habitat. Next slide. This project here with migratory land birds, you're going to notice some Rotarians in these slides. Stillwater Sunrise Rotarian John Lennis helped procure a Rotary District grant to send some Rotarians and myself down to Costa Rica to sign a sister park partnership between 14 national parks of the upper Midwest and 7 national parks in Costa Rica. That partnership still thrives to this day, and it's all focused on neotropical migratory birds. These are often the colorful birds that you see at your bird feeders during the summer months, but then in the wintertime, they get out of Dodge and they go back home to where they're originally from, and that's the tropics. Next slide. The middle slide here, I just want to point that out because that shows you the migratory connection between some wood thrush that had geolocators placed on them and the upper Midwest. They're all going to that one spot in the north in Minnesota, and that's the former Warner Nature Center. And then when they go south for the wintertime, they're going out to different countries in Central America. But that shows the great connection. And I'm sure you notice some Rotarians in these photographs in the upper left and on the right-hand side. It was a great honor for Judy Freund, Craig Leiser, and Fred Schreiber and I to go down to Costa Rica back in 2014, I believe it was. And to the bottom slide there shows the actual signing. And I was lucky to represent the National Park Service on that trip. And that's the director of Costa Rica's National Park Service. Next slide. And the last large landscape project I'll just talk about really briefly is grasslands restoration and rights of way as habitat. Next slide. After the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership was launched in 2015, we applied for a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant to actually restore pollinator habitat, and we were turned down. We did not get the grant. But undaunted, we applied again the next year, and in 2016, we received a grant of $198,000 to restore pollinator habitat. By the way, that top left slide, that is not your kitty litter box. That is native plant seed that was collected in the St. Croix Valley by volunteers. The middle slide there, that's a seed spreader spreading out this seed during the winter time when biologists tell us it's a good time to spread seed on top of snow because the melting snow helps pull the seed down into the soil. And that bottom left slide, that's what that habitat looked like the next year. And with that grant of $198,000, we restored over 1,039 acres of land at a cost of just $190 per acre. Next slide. And the last slide, I believe, is rights of way as habitat. There is a group down at the University of Illinois Chicago, their Energy Resources Center, which has signed up transmission companies and transportation companies around the United States to really be more mindful of how they are managing their habitat. And I just want you to know that the National Park Service is also part of this rights of way as habitat group. And we're looking at making sure that in our national parks, we take care of the habitat along our roadways and our other rights of way corridors. Next slide. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say 2 things. Number one, that these national heritage areas have been great to work with to help us achieve our connected conservation goals. And number two, these three areas, pollinators, migratory land birds, and grasslands, are large landscape initiatives that we can work on together in national parks and in national heritage areas. And I leave you with that question. You know, Rotary has been so good to the National Park Service over the years, you know, with the Operation Pollination, the St. Croix Valley Pollinator Partnership, again, under Marlene's leadership and Judy and Craig and others. But is there more of a place for Rotary? And I want you to think about that. And if you do think that there is more of a place for Rotary in working with the National Park Service, just know that we're open for business. And with that slide, I go to the next slide. And here is my contact information. If you need to contact me, please feel free to email me, call me, however you want to contact me, and we can work together. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to address the group today. And now if we can open up to Q&A, that would be great, if we have some time.
Chris, this is Craig Leiser.
Hey, Craig.
Since nobody else spoke up, I'll stick a headline in there. I think that it's incredibly important in our time of isolation, which is put upon us by the coronavirus. You can still go out and spread seeds without having to have a lot of help. You can still find areas on your property. Maybe even it's a back corner. Maybe it's no more than 5 by 5, 5 feet by 5 feet. But there are places where you can plant pollinator-friendly species of flowers and other plants which will draw birds, butterflies, etc. to your property. And it's fun to watch them. It's fun to watch the birds. It's fun to watch the butterflies. And I took my 8-year-old granddaughter out about a week ago, and she found a very large, squirmy brown caterpillar on the ground. Now, I'm sure it's going to be a flying creature later on, but she was proud as she could be, and I had never seen at this time of year a caterpillar, and here she found one. So
yeah, that's Craig. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because one of the questions that we can get is that, you know, why are you concerned about this stuff now during this time when we are concerned about, you know, the state of health of humanity with this virus? And I would just say that now more than ever is the time to be involved in making sure that our environment is protected. Now, when we all have some time on our hands, we can think about, you know, just like you said, you know, maybe working outside, getting some fresh air, some exercise, and doing something good for the planet by planting a nectar garden in our backyard or a couple of milkweed seeds. It is amazing what can be done, and I do appreciate that question, Craig. I also have a question from John Duntley. He would like a little more information on the status or steps with the North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix Heritage Area approval timeline. And I would just say this, John and all of you, that Congressman Ron Kind from Wisconsin is trying to have a bipartisan support. The 6 Congress people who live in the St. Croix watershed, they're trying to all come together to make sure that there's good bipartisan support before legislation is introduced. I know that legislation has been drafted. It undoubtedly sits in some committee right now, probably a House committee. But I would say in the next year or two, we'll probably see some action there. And hopefully between that and the Calumet, and also I should mention, I recently heard that Black Metropolis National Heritage Area, the proposed National Heritage Area in the Bronzeville section of Chicago, Black Metropolis may be set for legislation as well. So we could have 3 more fully designated National Heritage Areas in the next couple of years.
Ed, did we have some questions in the chat room?
Yeah, Paul. Chris, Dave Newman would like to, is considering re-landscaping his backyard with pollinator plants and wondering if there's a list to get appropriate plants, some recommendations.
Yes. In fact, I see that Kathy has uploaded a handout onto your Rotary website. And forgive me, I have a hard time going back and forth between the questions and looking at all your smiling faces. But there is a handout apparently uploaded, and Kathy, you might want to verify this on the Rotary site, that if you go to the bottom left and click on any one of those sites, you can actually put in your zip code and you can see what plants are most appropriate for your zip code. I highly recommend native vegetation, but even non-native vegetation, as long as it's not invasive, as long as it doesn't incredibly spread and ruin the native plants, go to that site and you'll see some of the native plants that you can use. Also, if you go to the right, you can see some of the National Heritage Areas across the nation that have joined Operation Pollination and have actually recruited other partners. I showed you the partners from the St. Croix Valley, but please also know that there are groups like Ford Motor Company, Marathon Oil, Basin Electric in North Dakota. They basically, their pledge was, we're going to restore 6,500 acres of strip mined land to pollinator habitat. Now, I'm sure that was some state requirement, but that also counts towards Operation Pollination for Northern Plains National Heritage Areas Operation Pollination project. So go to those plant species on the bottom left of that handout, and hopefully that'll help you.
Thanks, Chris. Nancy Leiner has a question. She says, we help with a small lake association in Stillwater. What recommendations would you have for our members in the shoreline?
Again, I would say go to that handout in the bottom left-hand corner, and you'll get all the plants that can be planted. I'd recommend that you don't mow down to your lake. I mean, maybe you can have a little spot where you mow down, but I would try to keep some type of buffer strip around the lake. I'm sure Craig Leiser could advise you. Right, Craig?
I'll try anything.
Yeah. And also, there is a group in Stillwater called the Pollinator Friendly Alliance. Lori Schneider is the executive director of that group. And I would highly recommend that you get in touch with Lori Schneider. And to do so, feel free to email me at that email address I had at the end, chris_stein@nps.gov, and I'll connect you with her.
I have another comment. There are 3 catalogs which I have, which provide a significant selection of native plants, perennials, flowers, etc. One is from Prairie Moon Nursery, which is in Winona, Minnesota, but ships throughout the Midwest. Another is Glacial Ridge Growers, which is up in Glenwood, Minnesota, and they also ship throughout the Midwest. And finally is the Seed Savers Exchange, which is down in Iowa. They specialize more in vegetables, but they also have a subset of native plants and pollinators that they can offer either as started plants or seeds, all 3 of them.
Thank you, Craig. Any other questions?
I got one here. Someone's raising their hand, wants to ask a question. It may be, Heather, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so hi. It's not so much a question, except I would be remiss if I didn't mention I've had the pleasure of working quite a bit with Marty Harding, who is the volunteer leading the work with North Woods and Waters. And I know this is a time when people are thinking about their giving, they're thinking a lot about basic needs, and that's really important. And I will tell you that North Woods and Waters is operating on a shoestring. And so if any of you are in the blessed position where you're getting stimulus checks that you don't maybe need, and you're trying to think about what to do with them, yes, basic needs is great, and we're doing a lot of work at that area with the St. Croix Valley Foundation. However, I know like environmental groups right now are kind of on the back burner when people are thinking about giving, and that work that Marty is leading, again, with a shoestring paid staff, your money would go a long way to help their work. So I just want to plant that seed. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't. So just something to think about. But thanks so much, Chris, for this important talk.
Heather, that was a great sales pitch. I did not pay Heather for that, by the way. But yes, the North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix is operating on a shoestring. Every $2,000, $1,000, whatever they get from various foundations that they have applied for is a blessing. So thank you, Heather, for that. I know, and Marty's a great friend as well, and I'm sure I'll tell her after this message that you gave a little promo.
Chris, Ann Frisch has a question or a comment. Ann, you want to?
Hi, how are you, Ann?
Sure. Hi, Chris. I am so thankful for the leadership of the people in the district. Marlene, I want to call you out for all your work out there, and Craig and Fred. I am concerned about a couple things, though. What is the impact of the continued use of Roundup in our agricultural areas? A lot of that. And I went ahead and treated my ash trees for ash borer, and now I realize that every insect that lands and eats leaf off the tree, the ash tree, now will die. So I wonder if we've really thought about how we're also undermining our own efforts at pollinator gardens and
pesticides. That's a good point, Ann. I've tried to, as a government employee, tried to stay away from that pesticide battle. But any of the groups that you are involved with, the environmental groups, will tell you that, you know, these neonicotinoids that can be found in some of the plants that you buy in, or a pesticide that you buy in some of these stores, if it doesn't say it's pesticide free, you may want to be very cautious about purchasing, you know, that plant, because these are very toxic, and even a small dose can do harm to our precious pollinators. So thank you for bringing that up, Ann. And groups like the Pollinator Friendly Alliance, they have lots of information on the effect of pesticides on the native pollinators. So I encourage you to get involved with groups like that.
what about the ash borer treatment?
I don't know too much about that.
Yeah, I was told that every insect that lands on that tree will die. And I was told this by the state environmental office.
And that's probably because whatever they're treating it with has
Right.
neonicotinoid.
So I'm not treating anymore, so.
Yeah, well, thank you. As an environmentalist, thank you.
I think, Paul, we about out of time.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone. Give Chris a round of applause. Thank you for being
It's been
here.
a real pleasure, guys. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. And it's nice to see some familiar faces. And I always love working with Rotary. So again, if you feel free to contact me. Lots of time these days. It's not that I'm not doing good work, even working at home, but lots of time, and we can talk about the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, this is Kathy Hewitt. Marlene has a request from all the Rotarians out there. If you have photos on your pollinating projects, if you can please email them to her, because she's collecting the photos. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just did want to say that. Sorry. Rotary Magazine may be doing an article on this, and if you have local photos, they would like to see Rotarians in photos doing pollinator habitat work. So please do send them to Marlene. Thank you, Marlene.
Great. So that's it for this week's Friday feature. Next week, little preview, Kyle Haugen, who is District Rotary Foundation team lead, will join us to share how the Rotary Foundation allows us to maximize the impact we make in our communities and around the world. hear how we can make a difference through the 6 areas of focus and the concept of positive peace. Looking 2 weeks out, on May 1st, we have a special evening Friday feature. It's our special night of connecting. We have our keynote speakers, Rotary International General Secretary John Huco, and special guest speaker Tiffany Irvin. That starts at 6:30. And we have more planned for the evening, so we hope you can join us. I want to thank Kathy and Marlene and Ed for co-hosting this Friday feature. Until next time, have a great weekend, and remember, Rotary connects the world just from a physical distance.